In episode 3, we talked about the resume. There's so much information out there on how to write an ideal resume, so we want you to know exactly what we look for from the experienced recruiting backgrounds that we've got, and hopefully dispel any myths about the applicant tracking system and AI in recruiting. Hopefully it's going to be really valuable to you with some tangible examples on what to put in your CV and how to write a really, really good version of it. Enjoy! The job market has changed since the pandemic, and so have the rules.
What worked 3 years ago no longer works. There's so much more noise out there and so much contradictory advice.
We're here to help you cut past the noise and decode the new rules.
And to guide you to your next opportunity. We're going to give you our shared expertise and help you figure out how to make the most of this post-pandemic talent market.
So join us on this journey if you're open to work. Hey James, how's it going?
Hi Matt.
We're obviously talking about the fact that we're both open to work, and the idea of this podcast is to kind of take some of our learnings as recruiters and apply it to kind of the broader job search for everyone out there, really. But how is you're currently open to work, right?
I am, and as we've already touched on a little bit, my partner and I were in a really bad car accident last year, and that combined with the fact that the job market, especially the job market is bad for everybody, but for recruiters, it's particularly bad. I was in the fortunate position to be able to give myself the whole year off. I started posting a lot more on LinkedIn, trying to be helpful, trying to offer advice. And I think because there was definitely an audience for that. There was definitely a need for it, because over the course of 6 months, my reach got really big. I reached millions of people, amassed 40,000 followers very, very quickly. And then that transitioned into me having a weekly column for Forbes, which feels like such a huge honor. And
awesome
for someone from my generation to have the seal of approval from a storied media brand and to be considered good enough to be featured in that is a really wonderful thing. And all happened, I think, because of what I started doing on LinkedIn and the audience that I built there. I think because I've been living in California for a while now, I've really learned the value of community and of putting good energy out into the universe. And because I had time on my hands, I started opening my calendar every Tuesday morning, and I give away free coaching sessions to anyone that's been impacted by a layoff or anyone that's in a job transition. What I found is investing that time in helping others gives me far more back than I give away for free, number one. But also it's become kind of a virtuous circle. When I hear the same questions 2 or 3 times in coaching sessions, it makes me realize that potentially many more people have that question. And so when I pick up themes from my coaching sessions, I turn that into a LinkedIn post. And the LinkedIn posts that get the most traction, I then turn them into a longer form post and write a feature for Forbes. And so it's been really interesting to use my brain in a different way to try and be helpful, to echo what you said in an earlier episode, to plant seeds, so that now that I'm actually this year in early 2024 starting my job search, it's actually easier to do that because of the community that I've built across LinkedIn, Forbes, and the people that I coach.
So Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all.
I feel like I answered a different question.
I mean, you did answer a different question, but it was still a really interesting answer, because I mean, more talking about kind of how, almost getting into like, how do you diversify and like what is being open to work? Like, how do you even
approach it as like a topic, because I went on a different journey, but it was quite similar in that became sort of somewhat disenfranchised with the interview process that I was going through, and I was becoming very frustrated with these processes that I'd kind of not been successful in, and we'll get into that in a whole other day. But decided that I wanted to take my future into my own hands and start to kind of share my perspective on my job search. Firstly, as an experienced recruiter, so it's kind of coming from like a similar perspective as you. But then also see if I can turn this into a business that I can kind of pay the bills with. I didn't have an endless kind of pot of money that I could get into it. I was dipping too far into my savings, and so I was like, right, I need to kind of get a bit more proactive, and I can't rely on full-time opportunities to kind of pay my way for the next 6 to 12 months or however long this lasts. So I started to post really regularly, and I started to open my diary to people. And then people seemed like they were interested in kind of particularly getting coaching and support from an experienced recruiting leader. And then so started to build out longer plan sessions and specific products. And that's ended up turning into my kind of coaching business, which I now have as like my side hustle, essentially, that will probably be part of my career forever now, which I don't think would ever have happened had I not been laid off, but or kind of also B, not started kind of posting proactively and kind of building a brand for myself on LinkedIn. And I think this kind of idea of having multiple things that we're doing at any given time and not just relying and putting all of our eggs in this one basket of kind of full-time work is just a really big part of what the workplace will look like in 2024, and what our jobs and how we will think about jobs in kind of the next kind of decades to come. I think almost everyone will have multiple jobs that they're doing at any given time. Probably potentially one large one with lots of smaller ones, but it will likely be multiple jobs.
I'm increasingly hearing and increasingly drawn to this notion of a portfolio career that, you'll have little sections, little different income streams, little different areas of interest. That idea of joining an IBM or a GE or a General Motors and working for them for 40 years, that hasn't existed for a long time, right? That's not the reality anymore.
I think, to be fair, it is for some people, but I think that for us and kind of where we see the world, it's increasingly less likely that that's going to be the case, and actually isn't something that actively appeals. I did speak to someone the other day who was like, I've joined this company and I think I'm going to be there for the rest of my life. And she was in her kind of mid 40s. And I thought that was incredible. Like, good for her. And my father-in-law did one job for his entire career. But he ended up selling his business that he led and he'd built from the ground up, and good for him. But I think that increasingly that's not something that I kind of feel like I can. It's almost like a risk aversion. Like, I don't think I can trust a business, having gone through what we've been through over the past kind of 4 years in recruiting, that they can support my life and my family in the way that we feel like we would like, and that putting all of my eggs in that basket financially is just too high a risk to take. And as a result, we've now been kind of almost forced to develop portfolio careers and it comes out of necessity rather than me wanting to do this for anything else. And actually, I love that. I'm loving it, but it has definitely changed my relationship fundamentally with the workplace.
Well, that's exactly the point, isn't it? And thinking back to that individual that you were talking about that aspires, and great that she's found somewhere that she loves and wants to retire there. But the problem is, that's not entirely her choice. And
exactly,
to echo what you said, I don't think any of us can trust any corporation, large or small, to keep us employed for 20 years. There's just too many variables.
Yeah. And I think and we can move on to our kind of main topic of today, but I think the businesses have kind of really clearly demonstrated over the past 5 years specifically that they are not great at workforce planning, and they are not great at adjusting to macroeconomic trends. And as a business unit, we are entirely reliant on others hitting their targets and growing the business successfully, and then also adjusting really and planning very, very well. And so, as the more you step back, the more you realize that actually you have no control over the success of the business. If you were perhaps in sales and you were running a sales organization, you might have more control. But in recruiting, you have so little. And that's kind of a real glass shatter moment.
Even in sales, you don't. Only if the product team can deliver what you've sold.
I would feel like I'd have more control over my career if I was selling the product over, myself, than if yeah. But let's not get down that rabbit hole. So today we have a really big topic on our hands, and we're going to try and get through it in a short amount of time. But it's the resume. This is one that has got multiple episodes that could be done just about whether or not there should be a skills column, which is something I texted you about earlier today that I was kind of raving about. Let's talk about the resume and what it's there for, CV, if you're depending on where you are in the world, what it's there for, what the audience is, and how to best create a CV that enables you to get the right outcome, i.e. kind of for you, and maybe our top tips as well for kind of building a good resume that's going to get you noticed. So perhaps why don't we start with what is a resume and who's it for?
Your resume or your CV it's just a summary of your career history, right? Like what you've done so far up until this point. That's actually what it means in Latin, curriculum vitae. Anyway, think about your resume as your entry ticket into the recruiting process. That's what it's there to do. Your resume is there to open the door and secure your spot in the interview process. It's your price of admission. And your resume really has two audiences, the recruiter and the hiring manager. And so what your resume has to do in a very short space of time, because a recruiter can look at a resume for less than 20 seconds and make a decision. And a hiring manager might look at it for up to 60 seconds because they look at fewer resumes than recruiters do. But in that very short amount of time, you have to convey to a recruiter what it is you've done, where you've done it, and the things that you've delivered whilst you were doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Really, that's all it is.
Yeah.
What was the job? At what scale of company, what type of company, what industry sector, and what were the 2 or 3 or 4 things that you did in each of those jobs to move the needle for the organization?
Yeah.
And its core, that's what you need to be including.
I completely agree. It's not about, and we'll talk about applying the actual application process in our next episode, but it really isn't about trying to build something that's for anyone other than a human eye. I think both of us agree, and we won't get it into detail in this episode, but both of us agree that the audience here is not some sort of technology that's reviewing your CV before a human looks at it. This is for a human to look at, and that's what 99.9% of all systems, applicant tracking systems are kind of, that's how they work. We've not seen any that has an AI front end that is screening an applicant, screening a CV on a person's behalf. And so this is, when we talk about what is the purpose of a CV, it's for a human to read, a recruiter or a job or a hiring manager to read. When I do kind of some of my coaching, I talk about the idea that, and this is again oversimplifying it to make a point, that recruiters essentially are in 20 seconds doing a matching exercise where they're kind of reflecting on the JD that they've got and the types of roles that you probably would have done in order to be able to get to the role that they're kind of hiring for. And they're basically matching scale of company, size of company, to job title. And then doing that maybe a couple of different times and seeing if they've come up the right path. And then making assumptions in their first review of a CV, and lots of recruiters review a CV multiple times, but the first round of CVs where they'll have hundreds they'll be looking at, they're probably doing a really basic matching exercise of do they recognize the brand, or are they familiar with the brand and what you've done, and have you done the role that they're looking for, or equivalent or similar role to the one that they're looking for, and the title ideally being the same. And perhaps then they might also look at things like team size, revenue size, business size, and valuation. And more than that, they're probably not going to do it on a first pass. It's going to be second pass, but you've got to be hitting those notes more than anything else to really get through that first round of kind of CV screen, I think we call it within the recruiting industry. Would you agree with that?
100%. And I would go further to say there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means to be qualified for a job. And what the recruiter is doing is trying to assess, based on your resume, whether you are qualified or not based on the parameters that have been set out by the hiring manager. And part of the confusion stems from we are rarely, if ever, explicit about what the full criteria are. So, for example, we might say we're looking for a marketing director that must have 5 years experience as a director in a consumer facing business. But what we're not saying is that consumer facing business needs to be of comparable or larger scale. Ideally needs to be within the same vertical, and ideally needs to be within a preferred competitive set.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter what you put in your resume, but if the recruiter can't divine that you meet those criteria, it almost doesn't matter. And so focusing on creating a resume that very, very accurately describes your career history is going to be far more beneficial than trying to craft this Frankenstein document that tries to open doors that it's never going to open, because it almost kind of doesn't matter what the resume says if it's anchored back to job titles or job roles in companies that aren't a match.
James, tell us about our American sponsor.
Many of the legacy ATS products don't use AI in any meaningful way, which is what is so innovative about Mojo Hire.ai. It is an overlay that you can add to your existing ATS that helps you better discover candidates that are already there and reduces discovery time by up to 90%. Their comparative AI tool is a real game changer, and you can learn more at mojohire.ai.
I want to kind of clarify something as well. CVs have been, the data really clearly suggests that CVs are a terrible predictor of success in role. And we know at scale, and recruiting organizations around the world know for a fact that CVs are rubbish, basically. And that they have no indication of whether or not someone is going to be good at the job. There is this idea of skills-based hiring and testing on the front end of kind of application processes, and we can have a whole episode about that one day. But that in reality isn't catching on right now. So CVs are essentially like democracy, if you will, right? They're the best of it's the best of what we got. We don't have a better version of it right now, so we're going to have to learn how to work within this system. But I do want to say that I personally don't believe they are great as a whole concept, but they are what they are, and it is the world we live in, and so you have to be able to craft one that is going to get you through the door. Getting into some more specificities about the format, let's say. What do you think needs to be in those bullets more specifically? Because I think that is really the difference between an okay CV, from my experience, and a fantastic CV can kind of be summarized in a single word, and that's data. What was the impact that you had in that role that ultimately that you can measure? Really spending time before you write your CV on collecting all of the data points you can possibly think of from your role that you did, and putting them into your CV that with the format of, my role was this, we had this task, we did these actions, and we achieved these results, will almost always position you very well in any sort of job that you're applying for. What's your initial thoughts on what you need to put into those paragraphs underneath?
Again, come back to the audience. Your audience is the recruiter and the hiring manager. Unless you've worked for recognized household brands, you have to do the extra work of joining the dots for those audiences. And so some really quick hacks. If the company you've worked for is not a recognized name, in the name of the company, turn that into a hyperlink so that the recruiter or the hiring manager can really quickly click on it and get more information about the company from their website, number one. Always use an anchor statement, a single sentence that explains what the company is. So a fintech startup in the personal finance space with $500 million in revenue and 1,500 employees, because they're not going to know.
Context statement.
Exactly.
And these context statements, I think, are really important because loads of other assumptions are made as a result of those statements. So especially if you don't know, like joeblogs.io or .ai, you are going to, but you see that, oh, they're $500 million revenue business. Wow, they've got 5,000 people, and you were running their entire HR organization. Blimey, okay. Now I'm going to look at this in a bit more detail, even though I've never heard of it. And you don't have to do that if you work for Google potentially, but you would have to do that if you work for an unknown brand. So setting that context is essential first step.
Super critical. So hyperlink, anchor statement or context statement, just a single sentence. Then obviously job title, industry standard job title. If you have a non-industry standard job title, change it to something that will be recognizable. And then for every role that you have on there, think about real estate and how you can maximize that real estate. And I always say between 4 and 6 bullet points per job role. And then for those between 4 and 6 bullet points, you want a 50-50 split between responsibilities and results. And so responsibilities are what you did, the size of the role, the size of the team, the size of budgets that you managed. And then results are quantifiable, either with a number or a percentage, what you actually delivered in that role. And you want to do that for every job on your resume. And really go into detail covering the most recent decade. Anything more than a decade, you can just summarize. You don't need that level of detail. But for the job roles that you've held in the last decade, 4 to 6 bullet points. And for each bullet point, split each section of bullet points, split your real estate between what you did and, crucially, what you achieved whilst doing it.
Yeah, I think if too many of your bullet points read essentially like a job description you find online in an OK company like job ad, you've probably missed. You're probably doing yourself a disservice. And when you talk about responsibilities, I kind of, that's still kind of context setting in my mind. You managed a team of 10, you had a £10 million budget or whatever it is. I kind of, when I'm going through CVs, I kind of ask the very direct question of, so what? When you said you delivered XYZ project, so what? Why is that important that you felt that you needed to write about that on your CV to highlight it to me? If you did a project, then what was the impact of the project? Why did it have an impact on revenue? Did you do it just because you were doing a job? Let's get into this so that I can really paint a story of what it was that you were doing for that company and the impact you were having. And if you're able to demonstrate that you understand the kind of broader environment that you're working in, you can really separate yourself from other people who are kind of just listing their jobs and their responsibilities.
The XYZ formula is great.
Tell everyone about the XYZ formula.
Delivered X by doing Y as measured by Z. That's your winning formula for describing the impact that you have.
Absolutely.
What did you do?
I couldn't agree more.
How did you do it? And how is that measured?
And I think a really good CV as well, it enables you to do really good interview prep. All of these things that we're talking about help not just for building a really good CV, they help for preparing for your interviews, getting your numbers straight, getting your storytelling straight. These one sentence stories you're telling are ones that you can then go into detail on, the how did you do it and why did you do it like that? And what would you do differently if you would do it another way? This is the bedrock. Doing this right yourself and building it yourself, I think, is really important to help prepare you for the actual interviews themselves. And if you can't kind of get these stories down and you want someone to help with that, then make sure that at least you have this context, action, result stories. At least you have these XYZ points so that you can speak to them when you actually go into the interview. Otherwise, no matter how good your CV is, if you can't speak to it effectively, you're not going to kind of get through the job anyway. Do you have any thoughts on format or on page length? Any rules in inverted commas that you would apply? Never do this, always do this.
There are certainly conventions in that, generally speaking, in the United States, a resume is a page long. And generally speaking, in Europe, a CV is 2 pages or longer.
Yeah, I would agree.
But, there are variations across both regions. In terms of format, just clean and clear and appealing to a human eye, because it's a human being that's going to be looking at it. And just think about maximizing the real estate, especially if you're trying to condense everything into a one-page format for the United States. Does everything on there pass the so what test? Is it using the real estate in the most impactful way to help whoever's reading it, the recruiter or the hiring manager, join the dots between what you did in an environment at the scale that you're used to being operating in and the impact that you were able to achieve? How does that translate to the business problems that they need to solve? Does your usage of the real estate on your resume secure your spot in the process? Does it get you in the door?
What contact information should be on a CV?
Email address, LinkedIn profile, phone number.
Would you include your home address or city location or country location?
Just city and country. You don't need to use your home address.
How about photo?
Unless you are a model or actor, or in certain European countries where it's the convention, like in Germany and France, then no.
And I would say, to add on to that unfortunately we do live in a world where there is bias, right? And so including photos, especially if they are not like the greatest photo, will potentially negatively bias someone against you. I think this is still incidentally a controversial topic I've heard from my network. And I saw a TikTok the other day that had lots of discussion about whether or not a photo should or shouldn't be included. I think it's cultural as well. Like in parts of continental Europe, having a photo is pretty standard. I don't think it would stop you from getting a job anywhere, but it is relatively standard to have a photo in the UK and the United States, at least. And in Australia, they are not. It is not kind of standard to have a photo on a CV. Would you have a skills section, i.e. keywords skills section in a CV?
No, it's wasting the real estate. The only valuable use of skills is in LinkedIn because it helps you be more discoverable. On a resume, you're wasting real estate. Who's to say that you have those skills, that those skills are relevant? Like, especially when you see skills with like 3 out of 5, like, says who? What does that mean? Like, no, don't do it.
It's one of my pet peeves on CVs. If you're a 5 out of 5 on attention to detail, you never ever miss anything. You're the best at attention to detail. That it's no area for improvement. You always get it right 100% of the time. Would you make multiple different CVs based on the jobs that you're applying for? Would you customize your CV for your one specific job that you're applying for?
You shouldn't need to. A well-written, well-crafted resume should be good to go 90% of the time for the roles that you're applying to. If you need different versions of your resume, like, it's implying that you're like not fully qualified. Like, it's just not, it's backwards thinking to me. Or that you're applying for the wrong jobs.
Sometimes I think that I would recommend changing your CV for the level. So like if you're applying for a head of role and you kind of are a director or a head of and you kind of don't mind, it's like sometimes people will exclude you because you're too senior. They think you're too senior for the role. So you want to take away their ability for someone to assume something about you that's not necessarily true or representative of what you're looking for. So I sometimes would recommend like adjusting your level, and I've done this in the past. So I have a CV, for example, that's a head of for like smaller businesses that are looking for a head of talent acquisition, and culturally that's what they would talk about. But then I would also have one that's director, which is my most recent title for larger, more established businesses. And then also for people who are going through career pivots, I think potentially you also want to give yourself opportunities to be open to different types of work where you might highlight, for example, let's say I was going for a director of people, for example, rather than a director of talent acquisition. I may consider highlighting certain elements of my background versus others. But I'd say in this market, that's actually particularly challenging, and we can go into why you may not want to do that. But I think broadly speaking, you have 90% of all jobs that I've ever applied for or that people apply for will use one format of CV. Submit your CV in a PDF format.
Yes.
If we were to only have one absolute, let's have that be the absolute.
Yeah, because you want your resume or your CV to be received in the way that you conceived it. And the only way to guarantee that happens is by saving it as a PDF.
Next time we're talking about the actual application process. And so we're going to get into some of these topics again in a bit more, potentially in a bit more detail. But until then, where can we find you and what are you doing next?
As ever, you can find me on LinkedIn, where I spend all of my time, for better or for worse. Or you can check me out on Forbes. My column is published every Wednesday.
And maybe even TikTok, I hear.
Oh, yes. You can find us both on TikTok. We've both just joined. More on that soon.
More on that to come. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well, on MatthewParkerAdvisory.com, and maybe on TikTok. Let's see how that goes.
We're going to go learn our dance now.
The Overwork dance is going to be sweeping the job search nation. Alrighty, James, have a really good day, and we'll catch up again soon.
Bye.
Till next time.